Norman groaned again and simply stepped through the archway into the plains. Norman looked back to see everyone still standing around the other end, but for some reason they all looked like they had seen ghosts. What the heck? Did Norman just disappear or something? I don't know, but we'd better find him, otherwise we're lost in this desert. Norman, who was a bit annoyed that his colleagues didn't seem to care very much about his disappearance, watched as Lizzie came to the front and stood in front of the arch, blocking his view. All right, since I am probably the only one who believes there's an invisible arch here, I'll just follow his path and walk through it the same way he did. If I disappear, then everyone else has to follow my same steps," ordered Lizzie. No one had anything better than that as an idea, so Lizzie turned on her heel and stepped through the bedrock arch. She came through it and her eyes suddenly widened once she reached the other side. "Whoa! That was cool," she muttered, turning towards Norman. "One second I was standing in a huge desert, and the next time here in some giant rolling plains. Oh. I just had an idea." Lizzie stepped backwards and experimentally put her arm through where the invisible entrance was. On the other side, everyone freaked out when all they could see was a floating arm. Quinn acted like the doofus he was and ran to the other side to see inside the arm, and he said, "Hey, guys. Check it out, I can see all the veins and stuff." "You?" Lizzie pulled her arm back through and giggled a bit before turning to Norman. "How come only you can see it? How come we've been walking through a replica desert every day and just suddenly come across a gateway behind us into the Serpent's Eye?" she asked. Norman shrugged and shook his head at the same time. "I don't know why I'm the only one who can see it. Although, I do know now that the error is also adding errors into biomes to confuse and trap people, and that might present itself as a problem later. Oh, finally, here comes the rest of the group," he added. Indeed, the rest of the group had figured out what to do and they were streaming single file through the bedrock arch into the Serpent's Eye plains. Even though they now believed that there was a hidden arch, no one apologized to Norman for thinking he was bonkers. Once Norman thought everyone was ready, he walked to the front of the group with his back towards the Serpent's Eye. "Okay, now that we've found the Serpent's Eye, we can find where the Creeper clan is located. So, let's go." "Yeah?" Norman again kicked himself for not being better at speaking in front of people. Although, his thoughts still kept in order with his plan, so he could hang on to that. "Oh well, at least I've got everyone alive to the Serpent's Eye. Now all we have to do is find the Creeper clan, take on their army while hopelessly outnumbered, fight their giant boss mutant and escape with our lives. Hippie-doo-dah-yay!" Chapter 18, The Mecha Blast Factory. Even so, the group headed out into the plains of the Serpent's Eye. Hillary's pets were very pleased because of the open space along with Butterball, who was nearly jumping through the grass. Apparently, he missed the plains and his fellow creepers. Norman led the group forwards into the plains for about 20 minutes, but for the most part nothing had appeared that was significant. Although, at one point they began to slope downward at a moderate pace. Norman surveyed around him to see that every area around him was curving down in one direction, and he figured that this was the Eye of the Serpent. They walked down into the crater until they had reached the bottom, which was flattened out and still quite large. Norman looked around for any sign of the Creeper clan, but nothing significant showed itself. At one point, though, Quinn brushed past him and walked to the very center of the Serpent's Eye surface and bent down over something sitting there. When Norman came to where he was standing, he saw that Quinn was looking at a lever that was sitting innocently on the ground. "What do you think this does?" murmured Quinn. Norman was about to quick grab his hand, but Quinn had already switched the lever. Norman heard a sudden hissing sound come from the ground. "Run!" he screamed. Norman grabbed Quinn by the arm and pulled him back, running away from the lever. Only a few moments went by before an explosion erupted from the ground, demolishing the entire surface of the eye's pupil. Norman only got a brief knockback from the force, but it knocked out his breath when he landed face down on the ground. Norman spat blood from his mouth and stood up shakily, looking back at the center of the land. A crater had been created by a large group of maybe 16 or so TNT. Norman approached the crater and looked down to the bottom, and was surprised by what he saw. The poking out of the dirt was a large surface of stone with an opening in the middle. Quinn grinned and ran towards the hole, his curiosity overcoming him once again. First he looked at a sign standing next to the hole and read, "Danger. Danger. Do not enter the Mecha Blast factory. Do so and die. Dang, I don't think they want us here." He looked down into the hole, and after a few seconds he turned back and yelled, "Hey guys. Check it out, there's some stairs leading really far down into the ground." Quinn was standing too close to the edge of the hole, because the next moment he lost his balance and tripped, falling down into the hole. The rest of the group rushed to the hole and Norman knelt down on the edge, but he could only hear Quinn screaming as he plummeted. About 7 seconds went by before Norman heard a dull thud somewhere far down at the bottom. On instinct the entire group started running down the winding staircase. Helpfully Quinn hadn't hit the ground too hard. The stairs kept spiraling downward, and after traveling down for about 2 minutes Norman almost thought that they would go all the way into the void. But thankfully, there was a convenient pressure plate that Norman had stepped on unknowingly. Norman paused when he heard a hissing sound, and suddenly his thoughts process told him one thing: TNT. Norman quickly backed up and bumped into Danny, who yelled at him for getting too close. Although, Danny too backed up right over the staircase edge and he fell down to the bottom similar to that of Quinn. Norman tried to grab Danny before he fell, but that didn't work out, and Danny plummeted heavily into the pit. Norman listened for Danny, but he didn't hear a thud over the loud hissing. Weird, why hasn't the TNT gone off yet? It would have by now, wondered Norman. His thoughts were answered when Danny yelled out from below. Gah! Norman looked to see Danny climbing up the staircases 20 blocks below, running up as fast as possible. Run! As Danny did a fantastic, and impossibly athletic, leap over Norman's head to zoom up the staircases past the rest of the crew, Norman looked down where the staircases were darkened. He saw a flash of green. Norman's stomach knotted instantly and he turned around to run up the stairs. Run. It's the Creeper Clan. They're down at the bottom. He screamed as he brushed past the rest of the group. Footsteps thundered loud below the group as they hurriedly rushed up the stone staircase, trying to outrun the angry army of creepers heading their way. The crew zoomed up the winding staircase until they had reached the surface again, and Norman felt so glad for the giant amount of elbow room. Everyone except him ran up the slopes leading to the pupil of the serpent's eye, and Norman shot a glance down into the chasm. At least 100 creepers were marching up the staircases already, sending a wave of hissing so immense that the air seemed to vibrate uncontrollably. Norman even felt a headache starting to form, which was weird because normally he wasn't bothered by them. Norman whirled around and ran up the grassy slopes of the Serpent's Eye until he was back into the normal plains again. He found everyone grabbing their best weapons, equipping their armor, and loading their hotbar with pork chops. Norman took his diamond armor from his own hotbar and slipped into it. Once he had put at least 20 pork chops in his hotbar, he gripped Shatter in his hands, ready for battle. By this time, the chorus of hissing had grown louder, and Norman suddenly realized that they might not have to fight the army. Norman quickly ran over to Danny, who was near the front with him and gripped his arm. Danny, block the hole's entrance with bedrock. That way the creepers can't get out. On a normal occasion Danny would smash Norman's face into the dirt as a reply, but since at this point he couldn't argue, he grumbled and sprinted back down into the Serpent's Eye. Norman and the group crouched around the edge of the Serpent's Eye and watched as Danny approached the hole. Norman caught himself rubbing his chin furiously, which was a bad habit he did when he was scared, while Danny was sealing the hole with bedrock. As Danny put down the final block of bedrock where the staircase began, a creeper's head came into view and it tried to jump out of the hole. Thankfully, Danny's bedrock had sealed the creeper's bottom half in place, and the creeper struggled while it was stuck, taking damage from suffocation. Only a few seconds went by before the creeper fell to the ground and despawned, leaving a lump of gunpowder. Norman could still hear the hissing of the creepers below, although the bedrock seal dulled it to a bearable volume. With a triumphant look on his face, Danny walked casually over to the lump of gunpowder floating or rotating slightly above the ground. When he picked it up, he walked into the center of the bedrock barrier he had created and held the gunpowder in the air. I think we all know who should be thanked for saving the fate of Minecraft. None other than the brave, heroic, handsome. Too bad for Danny, because at that moment he was caught off due to the immense rumble beneath his feet. Danny toppled over and landed hard on his butt. He quickly stood up and brandished his sword at the center and waited for a possible attack. The rumbling stopped, and suddenly there was a dull knocking coming from the other side of the bedrock. Reluctantly, Danny removed the bedrock in the center and out popped Quinn, perfectly fine and alive. Instantly everyone else in the group rushed back down into the Serpent's Eye and crowded around Quinn, all wondering what had happened. Quinn could barely handle all of the questions being chucked at him, and he struggled to answer any. What happened down there? Did you fight off that army of creepers by yourself? Did you see the mecha creeper? Norman squeezed through the dense crowd and managed to get through to the middle. Quinn thought of Norman as his friend, so he shushed everyone else so that Norman could ask a question. Quinn, how did you survive that fall? We thought you were dead meat when we saw you trip. He murmured. Well, it's kind of hard to explain. While I was falling, the feeling of it and how dark it was down there really freaked me out, but then all of a sudden I felt someone catch me, and it was Notch. When he set me down, we were floating on a giant cloud in the ether, and Notch's palace was far off in the distance. He said something about a secret in the end, but I don't remember what he said exactly because his voice was really distant. Then when he finished speaking, he disappeared and I found myself lying flat on the ground at the bottom of the hole, and the light was far above. I heard a bunch of hissing sounds coming from a long hallway to my right, and I knew that an army of creepers were coming. Thankfully, I found a brand new diamond pickaxe in my hand that I didn't have before, and I dug my way into the stone wall. I then started digging my way up inside the walls of the hole around the edges of the hole so that the creepers couldn't reach me, and once I was at the top I used my cobblestone to build a bridge out into the middle. I then realized that Danny was plugging up the hole with bedrock already, and the creepers were only 20 blocks below, so I started jumping up higher and higher by placing stone underneath me. But once Danny placed a block of bedrock in the final hole in the middle, I was completely surrounded by darkness and I couldn't tell how far away the creepers were. I was very glad that you guys let me out when I started pounding. Yeah? Explained Quinn. A few silent moments went by before Norman spoke again. While Quinn was explaining his story, Norman's mind was forming an idea. Okay, it may seem a bit far-fetched, but I believe you anyway. Now, I just thought of a way to destroy the Creeper clan and the Mecha Creeper all at once. Does anyone have extra sand or gunpowder? His idea was clear to everyone, and so Kelly stepped forward with 4 blocks of sand. Norman took them from her, "Thank you, Kelly," and then looked around for anyone who might have gunpowder. His eyes immediately fell on Danny, who looked exceptionally grouchy. "Danny, you find pleasure in killing things mercilessly. Do you have any gunpowder?" said Norman with the perfect touch of sarcasm. Danny did not catch the sarcasm, but he still was angry about forking over 5 lumps of gunpowder. Apparently, it turned out that Danny collected gunpowder as trophies for every creeper he decapacitated. On knowing this, Norman felt glad to relieve Danny of some of his obsessive trophies. Esmeralda then came forward and placed down a spare crafting table for Norman. Norman used it to craft a single block of TNT, which he took off quickly and carefully. He stepped towards the hole in the center, and shuddered when he saw a bunch of creepers staring aggressively at him below, and placed the TNT in the hole. As he received a flint and steel from Jeff behind him, Lizzie came up to him and leaned over his shoulder. Norman, are you sure we should blow up their hideout? I have a strange feeling something bad is going to happen, she murmured. Norman turned around and grinned slightly, trying to look reassuring. Don't worry, all we need to do is run like heck when I set it off. Once it blows up down there, all of the creepers will begin to explode on each other, and the base should be destroyed along with the mecha creeper. I doubt even that thing could withstand over 100 explosions at once. Norman struck the flint and steel on the top of the TNT and it lit up before beginning to fall. Norman jumped up and sprinted away from the hole, screaming. Run. The place is gonna blow. Everyone else ran out of the serpent's eye with him. Norman expected a sizable explosion, and the one thing on his mind was putting some space in between him and the hole. A few seconds went by before Norman could hear explosions underneath the ground, and the earth was beginning to shake violently. Norman struggled to keep balance while running, and only did he feel safe when he was out of the serpent's eye. The group stopped 50 blocks away from the pupil of the serpent's eye to prevent casualties, and the explosions from underneath were causing a full-scale earthquake. They stayed still for another 30 seconds while the explosions took their course, and finally after that time the rumbling stopped and the sounds ceased. They still waited another 10 seconds before walking slowly back down into the serpent's eye. Somehow, the top of the hole was visually unchanged. Norman crouched over the small hole where he had dropped the TNT. Looking down into the dark, he still couldn't see any damage. So instead he stood back up and turned around to face the group, who were waiting impatiently. Okay, I can't see any explosion damage, but only because of the light level. We should just remove the bedrock barrier, grab some torches and... He was interrupted by a gargantuan explosion that occurred from underneath. It was an explosion that sent everyone flying backwards about 50 blocks out of the serpent's eye. Norman, however, since he was standing directly above the middle, he was sent flying high into the air. When Norman was a little kid, he always wished he could gain superpowers and fly, but while he was hurtling upwards into the air at 100 miles per hour in a ball of flames, it wasn't great as he had expected it to be. Norman flew high up into the air and got a light-headed feeling when he passed through a cloud. Norman was trying to think about anything except death, so his dulled mind managed to acknowledge the cool moisture in the clouds that extinguished his flames. Unfortunately, he stopped just above the cloud and then began to descend back down. This momentum caused him to set on fire again, and he already started thinking about what dying would feel like. Norman almost didn't realize it when he slammed face first into a pool of water. Norman was submerged for a confusing and, literally, breathless second, but then he bobbed back up and took a gulp of air. He parted the soppy hair from his eyes. He had landed in a small pond surrounded by tall grass. Somehow Shatter remained intact along with his diamond armor, but the durability of each item was reduced by 50%. Norman then realized he couldn't hear anything. That monster explosion had blasted the life out of both his ears. Norman curled up his fists and uttered curses at creepers everywhere, because when he fought hostile mobs he counted on his hearing to help him out. Norman crawled onto the wet grass around the pond and climbed out into the plains. The scene round him was more freaking hectic than he had seen in his life. Chapter 19, Danny to the Rescue. The mecha creeper itself was marching towards him. The giant robot was 20 blocks tall, 7 blocks wide, and 5 blocks thick. Its torso was the biggest part of the body and was crafted from smoothly cut iron-colored dark gray with an X formation across the front colored black. The mecha creeper's feet were large and metallic as well while covered in rubber tank tracks, and they slammed into the ground with each step the mutant took, shaking the ground. The head was cubical and made of darkly colored iron as well, and a pitch-black creeper face was chiseled unevenly into the front with small red lights in the center of each eye, giving it a crazy, angry look. The mecha creeper looked like a weapon of mass destruction itself due to the many explosive features put into it. This monster had two slender arms that hung down off of either side of the chest, and they held giant explosive discs with red creeper faces printed on them. All along the shoulders and on the small neck of the monstrosity were grenade launchers at a total of 6, 3 on each side. To top it off, planted directly on the forehead of the mecha creeper was an extra creeper head that had no visible features, but possibly explosive ones. Before even moving, Norman felt inside his shirt for Lizzie's good luck charm necklace. He was relieved when he found it was still there. Norman stepped carefully out towards the mecha creeper, ready to dodge an oncoming attack. He had only walked a few steps when suddenly the mecha creeper caught sight of him. It jerked its head down at Norman and its red pupils glowed intensely. Norman looked up to see the extra creeper head on its forehead starting to vibrate. Norman felt a wave of electricity shoot through him as though he were standing below a hovercraft, and when he looked down he saw something. A yellow creeper face target was directly below him, and he looked back up at the extra head to see that it was charging up with static. Norman barely hurtled himself out of the way before the extra head shot an actual charged creeper at the target, which landed safely and then scuttled towards him. Norman took action and slammed the creeper upside the head with shatter, and the charged creeper flew back onto the ground in a daze. Norman took the advantage and jumped up before mercilessly crushing the skull of the creature. Norman looked around him and saw that everyone else was fighting as well. Lizzie, Stephanie, Bailey, and Butterball were fighting off a new oncoming wave of creepers that had survived the deadly blasts from before. Danny was attempting to rip off the rubber tank tracks that were helping the mecha creeper move, and everyone else was just circling it to find some kind of way to hurt it. Norman ran with all his strength towards the mecha creeper to fight. He had to dodge a couple of hurled charged creepers and grenades, but finally he was close enough to circle around the monster. As he did so, he couldn't see any weak spot at all, it was all solid metal. He quickly ran over to see what Bailey was doing about controlling the oncoming creepers, and he saw that she was trying her best. But as she turned the creepers against each other, her face began to look worn and tired, and Norman knew that if she kept it up she would probably faint from exhaustion. Norman wanted to help her and the girls fight of the Creeper clan, but when he started sprinting over to their area, the mecha creeper slammed its giant arm into the ground, blocking him off. Norman instead was forced to back up and avoid its newly launched explosive discs, which unfortunately were guided. Norman turned around to look over his shoulder and saw one explosive disc coming towards him at top speed. He could only think of one thing to do, and he whirled around and smacked the spaded diamond end of shatter into the disc, which miraculously deflected back towards the mecha creeper. He watched as the explosive disc flew and jammed itself in the left eye of the mecha creeper. A few confused seconds for the mecha creeper went by before the disc exploded violently, toppling over the monster in surprise. It shook the ground with a deafening boom, and for a moment Norman thought it was dead. Quinn was still stupid enough to examine it, and before anyone realized that he was standing at the foot of the mecha creeper while it was still dazed from the blast that had rendered its left eye useless, he was already up close. Quinn was inspecting the tank tracks still rotating around the monster's feet, and he tried to hack at it with his sword to ensure the mecha creeper couldn't get up again, but suddenly his diamond sword jammed in the tracks and was pulled out of his hands. Quinn dove down at the ground to catch his sword, but the piece of metal slid under too quickly, giving a groaning crunch sound as it was crushed. The blade was still scratching the metal of the mecha creeper's right foot underneath the tank tracks, and apparently the thing could feel that, and it jumped athletically onto its feet again, smashing its foot down on the ground repeatedly to attempt and dislodge the blade. Quinn was about to try and bury the thing in dragon eggs to defeat it while it was distracted, but the mecha creeper was angry by the painful blade scratching its foot and it kicked Quinn onto the ground by accident. Norman ran with all his might to grab Quinn and get him out of the way, but he didn't reach him in time. Danny did, though. He was busy working on dislocating one of the mecha creeper's slender arms, but when he saw that Quinn was about to be crushed, even he couldn't let him stay. Danny jumped off of the mecha creeper's shoulder, which he had somehow reached by climbing, and ran down the grass towards Quinn, who was knocked out by the force of the impact. Just as the mecha creeper was raising its foot directly above Quinn to smash out the jammed blade under its tracks, Danny created a ceiling of bedrock 2 blocks above Quinn's body. The mecha creeper was destructive enough to destroy bedrock, and when Danny could see cracks forming in the bedrock barrier above Quinn, he snatched up his body and carried him away just as the foundation broke apart. The diamond blade was lodged so badly underneath the tracks that the mecha creeper still couldn't get it out. Its feelings went from anger to agony, and it became unbalanced and fell to the ground with an even louder boom. Everyone fell silent, although Norman couldn't really tell either way, and they started watching the mecha creeper roll around in pain. It let out a terrible stretch of metallic hissing for at least 10 seconds before finally looking around it for something to help him dislodge. Unfortunately, the mecha creeper stared right at Danny, who happened to be the most unforgiving member of their group. Danny stood there and relished the moment of torture the mutant was enduring, and suddenly he ran forward with an extra diamond sword to stab the beast in the throat. But he only got into the air for a moment before a diamond arrow whizzed by and knocked the sword out of his hands. This caused Danny to become unbalanced, and instead of flying smoothly onto the mecha creeper's neck, he toppled over and slammed his head on its chest before bouncing back onto the grass. A few dazed seconds for Danny went by before he rubbed his head and stood up angrily. He marched over to Bailey and got right in her face. "What the hell was that for? I was just about to send my sword through its neck, you idiot." When Butterball started hissing warningly at him, Danny glared down at him instead. "Shut up, you stupid green hybrid," he snapped. Butterballs replied to this with a painful explosion that blasted Danny back 5 blocks onto his back. Bailey had used Butterball's back as a springboard, and she rocketed herself into the air just before the attack, and Butterball's body parts came together so quickly that she was able to land back down in time. Danny pinched his nose that was now dripping blood and cast an evil eye towards both Bailey and Butterball. If they weren't part of the group, he would have slit their throats right then and there. Bailey walked slowly down to the mecha creeper and stood by its right foot where the blade could be heard scraping the metal underneath the tracks. The monster was still in pain because of the stubbornness of the jammed blade, and Bailey had a soft enough heart for creepers to do the one thing no one would have dared do. She pulled back on her diamond bow and shot a diamond arrow straight in between where the tracks were pushed up, covering the crunched diamond blade. The diamond arrow's impact was enough to knock the broken diamond blade out from underneath the tracks onto the ground. As the tank tracks on the mecha creeper's feet retracted and stopped rotating, the robot made a relieved groaning sound. It then stood up and moved its foot to loosen up. Bailey walked around and stood where the mecha creeper could see her, and suddenly Norman realized what she was doing. He stepped forward and stood in between her and the mecha creeper. "Bailey, don't try and control the mecha creeper. If you fail, something really bad might happen. Even if it works, you're already exhausted and your heart might stop if you go through any more ordeals," he declared. Everyone, even Butterball, watched as she pushed Norman aside and took a step closer. "It's fine, I can do this." Norman couldn't hear exactly what she had said, but he tried reading her lips, and he made out, "I'm mine, I can't dual miss." Norman had no idea what the heck that meant, but suddenly she pushed Norman aside and stood before the mecha creeper once again. The mecha creeper stared right at Bailey and she stared back. Bailey seemed like she was trying to burn an impression of her face into the robot's eyes, and suddenly the mecha creeper's red pupils started to glow and it began hissing mechanically. Bailey kept her stance, and the mecha creeper kept hissing. Norman immediately regretted letting her try to take control over the mecha creeper, because suddenly she started to shake. The mecha creeper was still resisting, but Norman could see its glowing red eyes flickering and its hissing became choppy. Norman jumped when he heard thunder booming above. The mecha creeper's eyes were flickering even more at the sound of the thunder, and they gave out completely when a large bolt of lightning zoomed down and struck it atop its head. The mecha creeper let out a metallic grinding noise and stumbled backwards. It was about to fall over for the third time in a half hour, but suddenly it straightened back up and looked down at Bailey. Now its eyes were bright green, and as sudden as the thunder and lightning had come it was gone. Bailey let out an enormous breath and collapsed onto the grass, lying limp as a rag doll. Everyone ran forward to help, except Danny, who was still stemming the flow of blood from his nose, and they knelt down to examine her. Every few seconds they could see her twitching and making a cracking noise. She was taking damage at a rapid pace, and in her coma she couldn't do anything. Norman took action and snatched the cooked chicken Danny was about to eat and held it down over Bailey. After forcing an entire cooked chicken down her mouth, suddenly the twitching and cracking noises ceased. Bit by bit Bailey came to again, and in about 20 seconds she was strong enough to sit up and look around. "Memph. What?" she muttered. Jeff came forward and stroked her hair lightly, easing her back onto the ground. "It's okay, Bailey. You've succeeded in taming the mecha creeper, but now you just need to rest." Bailey nodded, but apparently that was the most she could do because the next moment she fell asleep right on the ground. Butterball shuffled up to her and curled up beside her, hissing affectionately. Norman toppled onto the ground when it shook suddenly from underneath, and he brandished Shatter as soon as he was up. But when he looked up, he saw the mecha creeper marching slowly towards Bailey, and as soon as it was close enough it loudly crashed onto its side and curled up just like Butterball. Norman couldn't believe it when it began to hiss in the same tender way at Bailey's pet, and he honestly doubted that a monster of the mecha creeper's magnitude could be tamed. The only other monster like that was Herobrine's monster, the Wither. Even the Wither was unstable, but Bailey was able to completely neutralize the mecha creeper no sweat. At that point, Norman wondered what other hidden powers he might possess that could rival Bailey's. Taking control of a giant robot and summoning a round of thunder and lightning, how the heck can I beat that? Wondered Norman. Esmeralda came forward and placed a bed down on the ground, saying, "I don't think we can move from this spot tonight if Bailey is in this condition. Should we rest tonight, Norman?" But Norman didn't hear her because of his sudden deafness, and Esmeralda touched his shoulder to get his attention. Norman jumped and turned around. Suddenly, Esmeralda put a hand to her mouth and said, "Oh Notch, your ears." Norman couldn't hear her, but for some reason he felt a sudden burst of pain in both his ears. He clasped them with cupped hands and winced, but when he pulled them back his eyes widened at the sight of blood on his hands. Esmeralda came forward and brought him some steak. Norman ate it up quickly, but when he looked up to see Esmeralda talking, he still couldn't tell what she was saying. He could barely hear any better, but suddenly he felt a smash on the back of his head that made him fall to the ground. On impact, Norman grunted in pain, but now he could hear himself. He turned around on his back and saw Danny standing over him, his nose now intact. "That'll fix ya," he muttered before walking away. Norman felt kind of awkward when he raised his hand towards Danny and said, Thanks." Esmeralda helped him up and pursed her lips while watching Danny walk away. "That boy has issues, major issues. Anyway, Norman, Bailey can't travel in her condition, maybe we should just hold off for the night and get going in the morning. It's your decision, are we going to rest?" Norman snapped back into focus. He had almost forgotten that he was their leader. He knew somewhat what Esmeralda was asking because he was only partially listening, so he nodded absent-mindedly. It was still morning, so they had plenty of time before the night would come. As the group of 10 set up camp, Norman set down his chest and took off his heavy diamond armor. Once that was stored away, he chowed down on 2 pork chops to restore both his hunger and health. The only thing he kept with him was shatter. He found that he felt incomplete whenever he didn't have his diamond shovel with him. The rest of the day went by in a dull blur. Actually, a smudge would be a better description. The supplies that had been decreased were replenished by several search parties, but once they were back and everything had been put away, no one had anything today. It was only midday, so they had half a day to kill. Norman found himself twiddling his thumbs while sitting on his bed. He was dead bored. When he looked around him, everyone else was bored as well. He saw Jeff and Esmeralda leaning over a crafting table discussing every way to arrange 3 pork chops, 2 pieces of rotten flesh, and 4 iron ingots. Danny was busy sharpening his diamond sword now that his nose was healed, and Quinn and Hillary were playing rock, paper, shears. Everyone else was lying or sitting on their beds like Norman, bored out of their minds. Norman shot a glance over at Lizzie and immediately felt sorry for her. She must have been 3 times as bored as everyone in the entire group. Lizzie would go bonkers if there wasn't something for her to do. Sighing, Norman stood up from his bed and walked casually over to Lizzie. She had her back turned to him and looked like she was slumping over. He tapped her shoulder to get her attention, and without warning she whirled round and jumped up into a standing position, which startled Norman greatly. When Norman regained his stance, he looked at Lizzie to see that she had a surprisingly excited face. "Norman, you gotta check out this green cylinder thingy I found." Lizzie held out an object with both hands. Norman picked it up and examined it. It was a thin cylinder covered in a greenish paper, and when Norman looked at the top there was a fuse and some gritty powder compacted inside. With a sudden suspicion he looked again at the papery covering and for the first time noticed that there was a black creeper logo printed on the front. His eyes widened when he realized what it was and looked up at Lizzie. "Lizzie, where did you find this?" Lizzie pointed a thumb over her shoulder towards the tamed mecha creeper, which was lying down near Bailey and Butterball's beds. "I saw something hovering and rotating off of the ground next to that mecha creeper over there, and when I came to look at the object it saw me. It may seem like a really aggressive monster, but honestly it's a sweetheart, and it let me pick up the green stick thingy without any hint of suspicion. Either that, or it thought I was another creeper. You know, you blew up its left eye or something?" explained Lizzie. Norman nodded and then grinned with satisfaction and said, "Lizzie, this is the first of the 5 keys that will open the prison gates in the void. Remember, each mutant would give one of those doorway drops that had both great uses and had the powers of the keys to open the prison. You know, Can't Rider told me before trying to eat the group." Lizzie's face dawned on a sudden understanding, and she let herself grin as well. "Well, what is it?" "It's the boomstick." "How do you know that?" "I don't know, I just know." "Oh. Okay then." Norman decided that he would have to test the boomstick's properties, so he walked outside of their camp. Finally the sun was beginning to set, so he had to test it quick. Once Norman was apart from their camp, he held out the boomstick in his and tightened his grip. Suddenly, the green compaction of gunpowder began to utter a creeper hiss. Norman held boomstick above his head and then threw it with all his might. The boomstick flew through the air with the same flight pattern as a fishing rod bobber, and it made contact with the ground above 10 blocks away. The instant it touched the ground, the boomstick exploded. Norman was out of range, but when he watched the explosion he noticed that it was only half the explosion of a normal block of TNT. Norman didn't even realize that the boomstick had materialized in his hand seconds later, and when he looked down he nearly had a heart attack. Norman could tell Lizzie had been watching, because when he came back her grin had widened by 300%. "Wow! That is freaking cool, dude," she declared. Norman smiled and said, "You're right, it does feel cool to have a stick of dynamite. I mean, the boomstick in my hand." This was an important enough discovery to tell everyone else, so before the sun were to set completely, Norman and Lizzie went around and gathered the rest of them together. Once they were congregated, Norman demonstrated what the boomstick did. Quinn raised his hand at the end. "So, what was the importance of these special items?" "Every mutant we defeat will drop a doorway drop, like the mecha creeper dropped the boomstick. The special items will have two uses. 1, they will have special abilities and uses that other items don't. And 2, each doorway drop is a key to get into the Era's magical prison in the void. Once we have the 5 keys we'll be able to open the gates and enter." "See?" explained Norman. Quinn nodded and then stretched, adding a yawn a few seconds later. "Well, I feel like a zombie having a sugar crash after eating 10 blocks of cake, so I'm gonna turn in." Before Norman got ready to go to bed, he took out his journal and entered yet another entry. Date 12, July 4th, 2415. Today we've finally found our first clan, which happened to be the Creeper clan. Because of Bailey's amazing work, now we have the mecha creeper tamed and on our side. What could be better than having a giant explosive robot to protect you? Now that we've taken care of the Creeper clan and its mutant, we can move on to the next one. I have a feeling it will be either the Zombie clan, the Spider clan, or the Skeleton clan. It would probably be a main hostile mob if anything. Although, I was reminded of how boring and long the days in the desert went by because all of the action took place in the morning, and for the rest of the day we were stuck twiddling our thumbs with nothing to do. I really hate it when that happens. Still, defeating a mutant means gaining its special item. We've got the boomstick in our hands now, so mining might become a lot easier now that we have it. I can't wait to see what tomorrow holds. Norman Cobweb. Now that the night was coming, they could finally rest. Norman even kept chatter with him when he crawled under his covers. As he began to nod off, he wondered what mob their next clan would be of and what the mutant would look like. The rest of his mind was soothed, and soon he fell asleep without a care in the world. Now if only Danny had remembered to put up the bedrock barriers before they went to bed. Chapter 20, Evil Causes Triple the Trouble. Down in the depths of the void the Era sat. It was sitting in a completely impenetrable cage of darkness and magic, stirring restlessly. The Era knew that it would not be able to consume all dimensions in existence without some extra help. The Era had sent its fastest and nastiest viruses into all of the other dimensions around it, looking for more evil forces to take control of. Although the Era was not sure what would turn up to meet it in its prison. The Era waited for a long period of time, possibly billions of years, since time and space in the void did not exist in a particular order. To its great relief, a ripple occurred in the empty space in front of it right inside the cell. Suddenly, one of his viruses flew back through the ripple and inserted itself inside the Era once again, becoming part of the monster. Another moment went by, but then another figure came through the ripple. It was the Pig King. The first dimension to respond to him was the 90th dimension, which held a large world of angry birds. The greatest pig, the Pig King, had taken command and tried to destroy the place himself, but the angry birds kept his armies at bay. The crown green hog fell onto the prison floor of nothing and glared up at the giant mass of plasma known as the Era. "Okay, what the heck is going on here, you giant blob of fudgy junk? I can't believe what you did to my army, destroying it with one big swipe of viruses. Era, we settled this the last time you invaded my personal space. What is going on?" In no way did the booming angry voice of the Pig King scare the error or startle it. A couple million years, days, seconds ago the error had taken a voice from a recording system and had lowered it so low that it was almost impossible to understand because the bass overcame the actual words. I have summoned you here for a reason, Pig King. The Pig King raised one eyebrow and said, Oh yeah? What's that? I have calculated the correct time of that outside of the void, and I know now that after 400 years of being stuck down here in the void that I have worn away at the magic bonds around my prison. I have done this enough where I can send pieces of me into the dimensions around me, enabling me to possess everything I desire with my nastiest viruses. Still, as I am currently trying to destroy the Ether Palace in the Ether and I have been aggravated on how stubborn Notch and his team from Mojang are while putting up a fight. Still, I have nearly pushed Notch over the brink, and Herobrine is finally slipping as well, but I think what the entire dimension needs is a little push to finally be consumed. So to conclude, I am bringing back together the TIDLOP, the Interdimensional League of Pure Evil. Together we will be able to rule all dimensions in a world of complete and infinite darkness. The Pig King looked hesitant for a moment, or a year, or a millennia, or etc., but then he finally grunted with irritation and rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. But if I get any more of your viruses possessing my pig armies, I'm gonna squash you with this 10,000-ton crown of mine, and believe me those gold points there are sharp. He threatened. Having no particular body shape, the error just vibrated slightly to show approval. At that time, another ripple had occurred in the air behind the Pig King. Suddenly, out popped a very short man. He was bald, but had some strange black runes tattooed on his forehead. He was also wearing silvery black robes that touched the ground. Okay, what's the big idea, error? Goes exclamation mark dot 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 was just about to overthrow Skylands, you nincompoop. Screamed the small man in his relatively high voice. Goes, I have summoned both you and the Pig King here for a reason. The error repeated his story and when he was finished, Koz looked bored. The error was not amused when Koz fell on his butt and became asleep, and as a reply the error's great massive plasma formed drooping black arms that wrapped around Koz tightly. As he was hoisted into the air effortlessly, he woke up and covered his face, cowering away from the error. Hey! Stop. No way. You can't threaten the great Koz. He protested as he was pulled closer and closer towards the error. Then the error opened its gaping red mouth to reveal the dark black hole deep inside. Only then did Koz finally scream. Ooh. Okay. Okay. You win. I'll help. The error dropped Koz to the ground, who landed with a small grunt. Then he blinked once before saying, There is only one old friend we must wait for now, and I'm quite sure that he will cooperate. The error froze when he heard a crackling noise coming from the ripple. Suddenly, a black tentacle poked out of the ripple and felt around the dungeon room. It lurched back and disappeared within a few seconds, but then something stepped through entirely. It was a very tall and ghostly thin man wearing a white morph suit underneath a black suit and red tie. He had no face except for blank white space. From out of his sides and back came 6 long, black tentacles, 3 on each side, and his arms were long as well, with skeletal hands. His entire figure waved and twitched slightly while he stood, giving him a ghoulish, demented look. The error raised a drooped plasma limb and said, Yes. Slenderman, I trust that you are feeling well. How are those miners, are they as tasty as you expect? Slenderman stood there and didn't say a word, his tentacles waving around slowly. Although the error and Slenderman seemed to share psychic connection, so the error could understand him. That is good. I trust you already have figured out why I have summoned you here, Slenderman. The error told its entire story through telepathic messages to Slenderman, and when he was finished, Slenderman's right hand reached forward to meet the Era's plasma mass. They shook hands before Slenderman walked over to Goz and looked down. Goz looked up and made a nasty face. "What's wrong with you, Slendoofus?" he commented.